Let's open our Bibles tonight for just a few minutes to Psalm 36. And over the past few months, I've noted an increasing tendency in my own heart toward discouragement. And I don't know that tendency in me is isolated, because I have noted that tendency in others that I know and love as well. I think part of the discouragement that I know that I'm facing can be linked to the rise in my awareness of the wickedness in the world around us. It's in human nature, but it keeps showing up. It shows up increasingly. We're told in the Scriptures it will in the latter days. We could say it this way: the world is bad and it's rapidly getting worse. And I think if we're honest, we realize that there are very few things that seem to be stemming that tide. It's quickly going in a direction that is alarming for those who know and love God. As a result of this, the sinfulness of man tends to grow increasingly big in my view, maybe in our view. We see this sinfulness of man. We see the lack of integrity. I'm alarmed on both sides of the political spectrum in our country, just the nonsensical lack of truth-telling I see rampant. And everybody just kind of shrugs and goes, well, that's just politics. That's just America. So wickedness grows large, and righteousness seems to be obscured. Tonight, I just want to spend a few minutes reading and thinking about with you a psalm that I read this morning, a psalm that I needed this morning. Psalm 36. In this psalm, I think we find a contrast in character. A contrast in character. I want you to watch how that contrast unfolds as we read through the text. We'll look at it in three parts tonight. You see, the psalm begins by describing the very thing I've just described to you. It describes the wicked. And here's what we read. Transgression speaks to the wicked deep in his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes. For he flatters himself in his own eyes that his iniquity cannot be found out and hated. The words of his mouth are trouble and deceit. He has ceased to act wisely and do good. He plots trouble while on his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not reject evil. These few verses at the beginning of the psalm, the psalmist is describing the way that the heart of the wicked one works. He's shot through all the way down to the depths of his heart. This transgression speaks to his soul. He's shot through with it. This is just how he operates. There is no fear of God. And he says here clearly there's no fear of man as well. Why? He flatters himself. He tells himself lies. In his own eyes, he thinks, I'm untouchable. No one's going to find out my wrong. No one's going to hate me for the wickedness that I do. We've long since passed the point in our country when people call evil good and good evil. We're no longer simply calling things those. Now what is evil is being celebrated. And those who refuse to celebrate are hated. That's where we are in our culture. People who are convinced, I can't be touched. My wrong is right, and the world is for me. The words of his mouth are trouble and lies, deceit. There's no wisdom there. There's no goodness there. You wake up in the morning and you start to hear what's happened overnight and you think, do people ever sleep? It seems that they must just lie on their beds at night imagining how to do worse things tomorrow. Is that not exactly what he just described? The wicked man who plots trouble while on his bed. He does trouble while he's not on his bed, and he plots trouble while he's on his bed. This is, it seems, a description of a day, an age in which we live. He sets himself in a way that is not good. And here's the thing. Evil comes and he doesn't say no. Does not reject that which is evil, just embraces it, just accepts it, just goes along with it. Friends, this is where the discouragement I've been describing to you that seems to want to rise in my soul comes from. It comes from that kind of reality of looking around and looking within and seeing wickedness. Thinking, wow, could it get much worse? We lose sight of what is right and good. It seems to rob us of our joy and our peace, our comfort and our contentment. It's amazing that almost anyone I speak to that I haven't spoken to in a long time, I can tell you, but basically one of two subjects are going to be the topic of conversation for the next couple of hours over the dinner table. The election or COVID, right? That's all we have to talk about anymore, it seems. That's all anybody wants to talk about. At some point in time, it just starts to get weary. I mean, the soul is just worn out. Why? Because we find that our meditation, if we're honest, is on the wrong thing. We just can't think on other things. We almost can't imagine a bigger thing, something more newsworthy than this, because this is what seems to be happening around us and to us and maybe even within us. The psalmist says this is the backdrop, but he continues. There's a second part to this psalm, and I want you to note this. I told you this psalm is a contrast in character. Here's one character, the wicked, but now what does he describe? He describes the Lord. And he's just described this one said who does not reject evil, and goes on to describe the Lord this way. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens. Your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. Man and beast you save, O Lord. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. Oh, continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright of heart. Just as the psalmist said in the beginning that the wicked man's wickedness, his folly, his deceitfulness, his lies, they go right down to the depths of his heart, and so he is shot through fully. The man is fully overwhelmed and filled with his wickedness. Notice what it says here, that the steadfast love of the Lord and his righteousness fill the creation. Wickedness may fill a man, but the righteousness of God fills the creation. They extend to the heavens. His faithfulness all the way up to the clouds. His righteousness fills the earth like mountains, before whom men look like nothing, like dust, insignificant. His judgments are like the great deep. I got to spend some time at the ocean this week. Just reminded, the kind of fish we saw jumping, we saw some dolphins. What are they, 5 feet long maybe? We saw some sharks jumping, 3-4 foot sharks jumping in the water. That's not the deep water. That was in the shallows. The judgments of God are like the great deep. We can't imagine. We can't even fathom the depths of who our God is and what He's like. And yet what happens is this. We find ourselves so overwhelmed by, so fixated on, so gravitating toward all of the wickedness that we see in this earth, that suddenly man is big and God is small. See, that's the problem. We get it backwards. We become convinced that man is big and God is small. But the psalmist knew better. Brothers and sisters, so do we. Man is not big and God is not small. Man is small. And God is unimaginably vast. So what does the psalmist say as he meditates on this character of God that fills the creation? How precious, verse 7, is your steadfast love. See, I think what happens is I find myself in the midst of times like we're in, grabbing onto all kinds of things that are precious to me. My peace and quiet is precious to me. I got interrupted today as we learned they were beginning to timber the forest behind our home. Oh man, I've not looked forward to this day. They're cutting the trees down. I like my peace and quiet. I like my privacy. I like my freedom, and I like to have my say, and I don't like to be interrupted, right? I mean, we think about the way we like our lives. Those things are precious to us. Wait a second. How precious is the steadfast love of God to you? Does it fill your heart and your mind? Is it something you meditate on and cling to and proclaim and rejoice over? You see, it's possible you and I may have gone for the last week or 2 or 3 without even considering the steadfast love of God, let alone treasuring that truth. The psalmist says, I see the wickedness of mankind around me. And what does it do in me? It brings up in me this understanding of, this love for, this longing for, this treasuring of the steadfast love of God, who does not change and never fails and cares for His own. How precious is your steadfast love? Where does my protection come from? It doesn't come from a tree buffer behind my house, right? My refuge is under the shadow of God's wings. Do we think like this? Do I think like this, friend? Do you think like this? Does the fullness, the satisfaction, the sustenance, the substance of your life come from God? Is it the abundance of His house, or is it the abundance of the house of your own making that satisfies you? Where does your drink that quenches the thirst of your soul come from? Oh, we know the words of our Lord. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. See, we hear hunger and thirst and we think, yeah, food and drink, right? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. By whom and with what? By God and with righteousness. That's what they're hungering for. That's what they're thirsting for. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from the river of your delights. Why? Because those things come from you. With you is the fountain of life. In your light, do we see light? I'll tell you how easy it is for my understanding of life to grow dark when I lean on my own understanding. I'm looking for light in my own knowledge, in my own common sense, in my own experience, and I'm hoping for enough to make it through another day. And where do we find the light to see? In the light of God. So what does he pray? Verse 10, oh, continue your steadfast love to those who know you. May your steadfast love prove to be exactly what it is, steadfast, unchanging. And your righteousness to the upright in heart. Now, the psalm's not finished. Because what you find at the end of this psalm is the fact that now the two that we've just heard described by the psalmist, they meet. And so what the psalm ends with is a prayer from the psalmist. He prays. He's just spoken of the wicked and he's described the Lord. And clearly we know of those two who is to be trusted and who is to be feared and who is to be run to and longed for and extolled and depended upon. So how does he pray? Well, here's what he prays. Last two verses of the psalm. Let not the foot of arrogance come upon me. Now it sounds potentially, the way we might read it, as if he's worried his own foot might become an arrogant foot. That's not the way the psalmist is writing. What he's saying is this: let not the arrogant come and put his foot on me. Don't let the proud, the boastful, the arrogant, those who are wicked, I've described at the beginning of this passage, don't let them have dominance over your people. Nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. Away from what? Maybe we should say it this way: away from whom? On the basis of what we've read already, it's clear that he is concerned that the hand of the wicked might come and force him away from the presence of his God. Don't let the wicked come between you and me, God. Don't let them. Keep me from you. Because what do you find away from God? In verse 12 he describes there, the evildoers lie fallen. They are thrust down, unable to rise. He said, when all is said and done, I don't want to be lying crushed beneath the feet of the conquering king. I want to be his. I don't want to be numbered with those who are against him. It's interesting that yesterday as I stood on the beach and we were preparing to leave Myrtle Beach. Mike Kennan commented to me, last day of vacation is always a sad day. It was time to come home. And actually, I think it was the day before that. I think it was on Monday. There was a family that came down to the beach near us. They came over and wanted to look at the sandcastles we were making. And the dad started to talk with me, and in the process of conversation found out that I'm a pastor, and suddenly the language cleaned up and the talk got spiritual. It was interesting. Exactly. On the spot, right? And what I thought was interesting is that even though it's clear that he might be able to talk better than he walks at times, this fella, I don't know, from another state, may never meet again. He made a comment to me about what he's watching in our country, in our world. He says, here's what I'm concerned about. He says, most of the Christians I know think this whole thing is political. They don't seem to understand that we are in the midst of a spiritual war. And guess what? He got that one right. We all sit back and think that it's just about keeping our money and our freedom and all the rest of the things that go on in a day and age like this one and all the things that are going on. There is so much more going on, my friends, than this. That's why I love the psalm like this, because he starts with one who is filling his mouth and his heart with lies, and he's giving himself to all kinds of wickedness and all kinds of imaginations of evil deeds, and we're watching that same thing happen in our day. And he describes God, the holy King of heaven, the lover of his people, the protector and the refuge of his people, the one who watches over and who loves faithfully his own and who rewards those who are faithful to him. But the final prayer has to do with how those two come into conflict. What do his people do? I think it's fascinating that the psalmist's response was not, "O Lord, make my arm strong as I fight off my enemies." He said, "Don't let their foot end up on my neck." Who was the psalmist depending upon for his protection when wickedness was on the rise? Clearly, he was dependent upon his God. Because there are a lot of things we can do in this day. I said it a few weeks ago. There's a lot of work to be done. So let's get busy. Fine. But I have to ask the question, are you and I praying? Are we praying as people who are less concerned about a political outcome than we are with righteousness reigning? With God being glorified above all else? What is our concern that moves us in these days? What moves us enough that it actually moves our mouths? What are we talking about? What are the conversations pointed toward? What are the arguments over? What are the discussions about? Where are we aligning ourselves? I've come this close multiple times to just being, I'm done with social media completely. I'm so tired of it. Because it doesn't take long to figure out where people are aligned. And you know what I'm finding? Very few Christians publicly align themselves with God. They align themselves with political parties. They align themselves with political candidates. They align themselves with political arguments. They align themselves with causes and movements. They've drawn battle lines that have nothing to do with the gospel. And they're going to die on those hills, and they're going to take people with them. But it's not about righteousness. It's not about holiness. And it's not about the glory of our sovereign Lord. And it's not about the salvation of sinners. And it's not about people who are won to Christ being converted of mind and heart and soul in such a way that they become truth tellers when they once were lie tellers. But friends, that's all that God's people are to be about, right? All of those things have implications for what we do politically and practically and socially. But when what all people hear from us is the stuff that they're hearing from everybody else, oh yeah, and come to church with me on Sunday. Why should they? Because they think they're just going to hear more of the same, just from a different slant. What I find fascinating about this psalm is this, that at the end of the day, the psalmist's concern was making sure that when all was said and done and the dust had settled, he was aligned with God. He was aligned with God. And friends, I want to plead with us that we would be a people who find our joy, our peace, our satisfaction, our completion, our fulfillment in Him. Not Him and, in Him. Is He enough for you? Is He enough for me? Or is it him and your guy wins in November? Or is it him and the next justice is somebody you approve of? Is it him and, or is it him? You see, those who are loyal and their allegiance is true to him, will be concerned about other things as well. Friend, where do we start? We started by saying right now, a lot of us are really, really prone to being overwhelmed with discouragement. Our souls downcast. Our minds and hearts overwhelmed. Discouragement troubling us because of all that we see around us. And what do we find as we read this psalm and others like it? Is that those who are aligned with God, those who find Him to be their treasure, those who find His steadfast love to be precious to them, those who drink from His river and eat from the abundance of His table, something is different about them. At the end of the day, they will be opposed by the arrogant, but they will not be ultimately defeated by them. They will be aligned with the one who ultimately wins every battle. and will be the conquering king of all the earth. So friends, in the meantime, do we talk and do we pray and do we preach and do we speak to one another as those who are confident in that God we say we know and love? Or do we find ourselves being so beaten down by the difficulties and the discouragements of life that people would have to wonder if we really believe what we claim to believe when life gets hard? I'm praying for me and I'm praying for us that we would be a people who will find our joy and satisfaction in God alone. And by His grace, may we be different in difficult times from those who are not satisfied in Him. All right? So let's pray like that tonight.